Have to change the features. Okay, ladies and gents, as soon as we're going to be live, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everyone. So if we are live, if you're seeing us live, good morning. Great to see you all. Give it 2 minutes and we'll be on with everybody. Okay. Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. So good seeing you all. And we are live now on Facebook and YouTube, as well as here in the Zoom room, Chabad Senior Zoom room. Let's begin. What I'd like to do is I actually want to continue yesterday's theme. So those of you who were with us yesterday, or if you're watching our videos as they're now posted on YouTube, we're going to continue on that theme. Because yesterday we talked about the importance, 3 different directions, as the Mishnah puts it, of relating with others. And we looked first at looking up to a mentor. Then we looked laterally, how we deal with our colleagues. That we should all have friends, and sometimes that even comes at a cost, and you have to invest in friendships. And finally, the last part we learned of the Mishnah was how to judge everyone favorably. So today we're going to continue on the first theme because it's related to the Parsha this week. What's this week's Parsha? Yisro. And the main theme of the Parsha of Yisro starts off the words by Yishma Yisro. Yisro heard. What did Yisro hear? Yisro heard about the miracles, the wonders that occurred for our ancestors in the desert. Now, the interesting thing is, he wasn't so taken necessarily by the 10 plagues. He wasn't taken by he was taken by the splitting of the sea, which is miraculous. Although every single morning when we say our blessings, one of the brachas we say is, Roka ha'aretz alamayim, blessed Hashem, who spreads the earth over the water. Next to O.R. Tambo Airport, there was a big billboard that I used to see. Don't know if it's there. I haven't been to O.R. Tambo in over a year. But back in the day, when we used to fly once upon a time, there was a big sign outside O.R. Tambo, an ad. It said, water covers 70% of the world. We cover the rest. UPS. So I thought it was a nice, clever little advertisement for United Postal Services. Are they around these days? I don't know who's around. We're around, thank God, right? But the fact is that it's miraculous that God spreads the earth in between the waters. So in a sense, we see the heaven, the earth is split. The waters above, the waters below. It's miracles. And every aspect of life, truthfully, is miracles that we have to be aware of in our life. And if we just paid attention, how much would you be willing to pay for eyesight if, God forbid, a person lost their eyesight? How much is somebody willing to pay to have it restored? How much is one willing to pay to have a hand, a finger? And if we just look at the blessings that each one of us really has in our lives, we'll be eternally grateful for each blessing. So Vayishma Yisro Yisro here is about the great wonders and miracles. Again, it's a reminder about the miracles present in our lives too. We certainly should be cognizant and aware of those miracles that each one of us has, and thank God for those. So Yisro comes and he joins the Jewish people. We're also going to read about the great event, the giving of the Torah. So this Shabbos, if you can make it to Shul, you should be there to hear the 10 Commandments. But let's learn a little bit about Yisro. And in fact, I'm going to call it the secret to success. What is the secret to success? What would you say it is? It's a question that many, many people ask. And we hear it all the time. We all want to be successful, whether in your business, whether professionally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, whatever area and aspect of life that we want to be successful. Who doesn't want to be successful, eh? So obviously there are many answers to this and many components. And personally, I like listening to Tony Robbins and all the other motivational speakers, Zig Ziglar, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the Coveys. In fact, my first foray in this area of self-help as a teenager was I read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens by Sean Covey. His father, Stephen Covey, is like the father of these teachings. But I remember reading that book and it really inspired me. And then what I realized is everything he says in there, the truth is we find it in the Torah. This week we're reading about God giving us the Torah. God gives us everything, but I guess it's in the packaging, eh? Because he certainly did a good job in the packaging and got me a little bit more excited about that. That's why I try to make little slides to keep the shiurim somewhat interesting. You know, if this pretty face isn't so nice to look at least hopefully there's nice slides to see along the way. So with the various answers that there are about what defines success, it's a question we ask ourselves all the time. And one recurring theme that you could find across all the disciplines that one could study, go to Dale Carnegie. You know, anyone here has read Dale Carnegie? I've taken Dale Carnegie courses, read many of their books. Fascinating stuff, but he'll also tell you, you know, he's honest about it in his introduction. Dale Carnegie says, I took it from the Torah. He says it straight up there. So I'm sure he's got plenty of his own ideas too. I'm not endorsing everything Dale Carnegie teaches, although personally I've enjoyed and learned a lot from his teachings. But the point is, one theme I find running across all these different motivational speakers about success in life is the value of having a mentor. And that's what we talked about yesterday. And it's interesting. I was looking at some statistics that's worthwhile to share with you. 80% of CEOs who were polled said that they have mentors. Did you know that? Mentorship is very important. I got a lot of mentors. Many of you here are my mentors. You should know that. I've asked many of you for advice and love to hear. I feel like advice, you know, it's the only commodity with more in supply than demand, but there's nothing wrong. Good advice is always, hey, don't run away. Sorry. So that's one thing. And data has shown how important it is for people to have mentors. That's, let me just find some other statistics that I found. Okay, here's something interesting. Data from an emerging workforce study showed that 35% of employees who don't receive regular mentoring plan to look for another job within 12 months. That's very interesting. And this comes from a website about management mentors. It's quite fascinating. Let me just pick up a few more here. 59% of mentored teenagers earn better grades. How do you like that? By the way, I'm drinking here. I hope it's not disrespectful. I want you to be able to feel comfortable to drink as well. Whatever you have in your cup, you know, alcohol has been re-allowed. It's legal now, so you're welcome to drink whatever you want. An Irish coffee, that's also fine. Don't worry, this one's not Irish. It's a Russian coffee. You know what Russian coffee is? I was Russian this morning, so I rushed for that coffee. Okay, 27% of mentored youth, they said, are less likely to begin using alcohol. When I was in yeshiva, mentorship was a very important thing. Everyone was meant to have a mashpia. And what's interesting is today is the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's wife, Rebbe Tzimchaya Mushka. And I'm just thinking, the Rebbe had a major campaign where he spoke about this idea that we discussed yesterday, the importance of every person having a mentor in their life, someone who you could look up to. It obviously has to be somebody who you respect, who you would heed their advice, who would look up to that person. It's not a matter of age, but it is a matter of, you know, you can obviously turn to somebody who's successful in business for business mentorship. And so when it comes to religious matters, I would recommend finding a mentor, someone who you respect when it comes to religious and spiritual matters. But obviously someone you listen to their advice and not just go advice shopping. So there's a lot that talks about the statistics of mentorship, whether it's young or old. There is the importance of that development within ourselves, and it certainly helps one's self-esteem if we can seek out advice in life. And so that's just some examples of the importance of having mentors in life. Young entrepreneurs who are starting out their businesses. There's a wonderful organization in our community called OrtJet. Anyone here familiar with OrtJet? I think it's, by the way, global, but we have it here in Johannesburg. And OrtJet mentors young people in business. And the truth is, here at Chabad House, we also have a mentorship program as part of Project Natan, which is helping people to start up their businesses, to get involved in whatever business. You want advice from people who've had experiences, who've had their ups and downs, their failures. So if you have someone you could hold their hand through the moments of doubt, through difficulties, it could be invaluable. Having someone to guide us through whatever challenges we have in our own lives, not only business. I'm talking about every aspect, whether it's spiritual or otherwise. So, are you ready? How many of you have had mentors in life? Anyone want to share in the chat box? Okay, you don't have to tell me. Fine. It's not my business if you have. But if you don't have a mentor, what I want to say is, do you think of having one? It's not easy. You have to make yourself somewhat vulnerable. I know my challenges as well with that. But what are you going to look for if you do want a mentor? Since we talked yesterday about the importance of having a mentor, that the Mishnah tells us, every person should have a guide, a spiritual guide, just as you would want in your business matters. So let me ask you now, if you're looking for a mentor, do you think our Parsha can give us some qualities of a mentor that you should look out for? What, if you were looking for a business mentor, what are you going to look out for? Obviously, you want someone who has had success, someone who perhaps, has some certain professional capacity, right? When it comes to spirituality also, right? Just like you want someone who's financially successful to be your business mentor. So let's look at the story of Yisro in our Parsha. And I just thought that is a good way to continue this theme about mentorship and to learn about the importance of mentors in our lives because of the significance. And as the studies have found, that the value of a mentor is truly, truly invaluable. So with that in mind, let's look at the Parsha. We see that Yisro comes and he joins the Jewish people and he's spending good time with his son-in-law. Who is his son-in-law? None other than Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. And they're spending some time, catching up on life, talking, what did they do in those days? Offer sacrifices to God, dining together. So Yisro comes, he's got a son-in-law, one of the greats, Moshe Rabbeinu. And not long after that, in this week's Parsha, we read about it. God gives us the Torah. And we read there everything that happened. We're not going to read it in this Parsha, but we know what happens not long after the giving of the Torah. A mere 40 days later, right? 17th of Tammuz is the dramatic event where we betrayed God, an act of infidelity. We worshiped, they sinned the golden calf. And Yisro is there to witness all this. He comes before God gives the Torah. And then he's there when he sees this great monumental event. He sees our greatest heights. And then he sees how we stooped so low. And before I go further, actually, let's just think one more point. And then he sees Moshe Rabbeinu goes up on the mountain. He sees the leadership quality. And Moshe pleads and begs God for forgiveness. And Yom Kippur comes and God grants us actual forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf. But of course, this is symbolic of God's forgiveness for us, always. And of course, I think this is a very, the message of this is very powerful, seeing the yo-yo of life, the ups and the downs, how we had our better times and our more challenging times. And Yisro is there to see this all. So I think that's quite a telling thing, that he gets a very good inside view, having a daughter, Tzipporah, married to Moshe. And therefore, I think he's got some good advice for us. Just a moment, I need to just fix up one of our technical features here. Hopefully it's done. So let's see what happens. Moshe comes down from the mountain with the second tablets on Yom Kippur, and it's time for us to settle into a new routine. We've had the ups and the downs, the better times, the worst times, and this is what happens next. The next day, Yisro is puzzled by what he sees. Okay? What does he see? So let's look at the Parsha this week. If you're looking inside your Chumash, then let me just find the place very quickly. We are chapter 18, and let me just find the verse. I'm going to read 3 verses now, 13 through 16. I'm sorry I did not put them on the screen. Okay, but I just put a little summary here. Vayehi mimacharas. It came about the next day, and Vayeshev Moshe lishpot ha'am. Moshe sat down to judge the nation, the people. Vayamod ha'am Moshe min haboker ad ha'erev. And the people stood before Moshe from morning until evening. Okay, Moshe is very, very busy. He's occupied dealing with judging the people, counseling. It's a rabbinic pastime. Vayar chosa Moshe's kol asher hu oisa la'am vayomer ma hadavar hazer asher ata oisa la'am. When Moshe's father-in-law Yisro saw what he was doing to the people, I'm reading it straight out of the Chumash. What does he say? What are you doing? What's going on here? It's a very important point, he tells him. Why are you doing all this yourself? Delegate, delegate, delegate. Isn't it better when you can delegate responsibilities? It was hard for me to learn delegation, but let me tell you, since I've been able to delegate some of my tasks, I get a lot more done, or I have a little more free time. Just kidding. But the point, Yisro is saying, why are you doing this all yourself? Are you a micromanager, Moses? From morning to night, you're judging the people. What about a little bit family time? What about self-time? So this is what Yisro sees and bothers him. And so he advises Moshe to create this whole legal system that he doesn't have to wear himself out, because we know it's very interesting. And we had a speaker last year coming out here to South Africa to talk to the rabbinic fraternity. And they showed us various statistics that rabbis, and maybe not just rabbis, anyone in this profession, pastoral care, imams, priests, oftentimes this industry suffers from a lot of burnout. I don't know how many of you know of rabbis who've abandoned ship, so to say. But Yisro sees this and he says, Moshe, you're spending literally your entire day judging the people, teaching them the Torah's laws. There are millions of people. There were approximately 3 million people who left Egypt with you. And there's probably lots of legal issues. We know how it could go sometimes. So you're going to deal with this all by yourself? So it's true. And personally, I'm not privileged to speak on this because unfortunately my father-in-law passed away before I married Batya. And I don't think my father interfered much in Batya's affairs. But some people kvetch. You know why a father-in-law, you know what the Yiddish name for father-in-law is? Anyone know? Who wants to chime in? Tell us, what's the Yiddish name for a father-in-law? Shver, that's right. You know what shver means? Difficult. Some people ask them, why isn't the mother-in-law called shverer? Okay, but again, I'm so lucky. And it's not just because we live so far away from each other. My mother-in-law's a darling. She's really wonderful. So nothing that I could relate to these cliches, to these, what do they call them, stereotypes of in-laws. But here it seems, in the Torah, we have that stereotype going on right here, where the father-in-law is interfering with his son-in-law, giving him unsolicited advice. And he tells him, listen, son, you're not doing this right. He's worried about his daughter. He's worried about his grandchildren. So he is telling him what he should do. and he gives Moshe all the advice, which you'll have to be at Shul this Shabbos, or just open your Chumash and continue reading. The next thing he tells him, where he starts advising him on how he should run his business, which very simply is how he should delegate, how he should have different people who are going to be heads of 10s, of 20. It's a whole story. It's in the Parsha. I won't read all the details. You have to read it yourself. But the point is, he's saying, look, this is the way you should do it for your sake, for my daughter, your wife's sake, the family's sake. And how would you respond to your father-in-law? Hey, ever gave that some thought? Now I'm just thinking, if I was Moshe and I can't take the heat, I'd probably say something. Look, I've been managing just fine without you. Sometimes people give their advice and like, thank you very much, don't need it. But Moshe, to his everlasting credit, doesn't bat an eyelash. And what does he do? Let's read the verse inside. By Yishma Moshe lekol chosna. Moshe listened. He obeyed his father-in-law's advice. Vayas kol asher amar. And he did exactly what his father-in-law recommended. Moshe chose men of substance from all the Jewish people. And he appointed them to be heads of the people. Sarei Alafim, Sarei Meah, Sarei Hamishim, Sarei Asaris, and it describes then how these leadership, how the leadership worked, okay? The tens of hundreds, tens of thousands, so there's no need to bother Moshe every single time two people get into a fight over ichles, whatever people get into fights about. And here we have Moshe's system. He follows his father-in-law's advice, and he had the different levels of magistrates who were going to deal with all the issues, and only the tougher, bigger, major issues where they have to go to the appeals court, so to say, Moshe will deal with himself. But otherwise, he listened to his father-in-law. And here we see right away the beginning of the secret to success, the significance of listening to advice. Okay? Now, listen, you have two ears. You could always, and if you don't like the advice, right? What do they say? Our New Year's resolutions come in one ear, in one year, out the other. Well, but at least to listen, Moshe not only listens, he heeds the advice. In fact, there's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing, we hear noise all the time as long as your ears work. But Moshe doesn't only hear, he listens. He actually implements the advice that his father-in-law gives him. So now, if you look at this exchange between Moshe and Yisro, you wonder, what was Moshe thinking? Did he really think he was able to judge all the people by himself? Why was it that Yisro, a stranger, his father-in-law who's coming from a visitor, has to give him this very simple suggestion to put this hierarchical system in place? Couldn't have thought of it himself. And it's a question that's discussed in the Talmud and other places. I'm not going to get into too much detail about this. But what was Moshe thinking? Why couldn't he do it? He had a wise brother, Aaron. There were the sages. There were many. Right? The Torah itself describes the elders. You could see right here, Moshe appoints people. There were the Nesiim. There were the tribal leaders. There were plenty of people Moshe could advise. I mean, after all, we were called a wise and understanding nation. So why did Moshe not think of this himself? And why did the others not advise him? But there's a nice expression. Actually, we learned it here in South Africa when I first came here over 18 years ago. So nearly 19 years ago, I learned this expression. What am I saying? 19 years ago I came. More than 19 years ago I'm here. So when I came here, somebody said these words: "A gast faravayel zetaf amayel." Anyone know what that means? A guest for a while sees for a mile. It often takes an outsider to set things straight. Oftentimes people think about all the tsaras, all the problems we have here in this lovely land. Yeah, there are plenty of problems, but there's lots of good things too. And we're better off here than many other places in the world. There's no doubt about that. Sometimes we have to just wake up, open our eyes, and count the blessings we have, as we said earlier. So sometimes you're in your own little cocoon and you don't realize the benefits or sometimes the shortcomings. Right? Sometimes a business will spend years chasing his tail without generating a profit. And what happens? An outsider walks in, takes one look at the place, and points out that, what the problems are. But while that might be common amongst inexperienced people who are in it over their heads, it's difficult to assume that for such a big problem, a solution as obvious as Yisro's would have just slipped by Moshe, Aaron, all the other great leaders and prophets at that time. So what's really going on here? So one of the commentaries says as follows. Here we go. Yeah, here we get the question. Why Yisro? Was everyone else just so oblivious to this? But we're going to take a little journey through this point. And as you can see, it's like the big elephant in the room. Says the Shach, neither God nor Aaron nor the 70 elders could have offered this solution. Were God to suggest it, Israel would begin to doubt Moshe's capabilities. Aaron was afraid to suggest it. He doesn't want to be punished for causing Moshe heartache. Likewise, it would be inappropriate for the 70 elders to bring up such a solution. And it wouldn't have been appropriate for Moshe himself to bring it up because the people might think that he's weak. Only Yisro, an outsider, someone who's coming, the guest, so to say, the visitor, had the suggestion. He said, had the suggestion come from Israel, it would distress Moshe. Had the suggestion come from Moshe, it would distress Israel. Had the suggestion come from God, it would distress everyone. Therefore, the Shach says it was Yisro came up with this idea. And the Shach explains that the solution was obvious to everyone, but there was little anyone could or was willing to do. Yisro is coming from the outside. The visitor, he wasn't bound, so to say, by the social rules, and he was able to cut to the chase. He was able to advise, this is what's appropriate. So this is the idea, that expression, the guest for a while sees for a mile. Sometimes the guest, the outsider, could see things with a little bit more clarity. But still, it seems like an awkward situation that his father-in-law is the one who has to advise him on this. It just seems so, we're not talking about trivial matters. We're talking here about a central, crucial system, the court system of the Jewish people. How could it get stuck around, this? How could they not figure it out themselves? So this is the issue that has been the elephant in the room, so to say. Now, just to try to address the larger question, there's a fascinating insight teaching from the Rebbe that I want to share with you. And this perhaps can give us another way of seeing this. Okay? So let me just quickly open up here the talk of the Rebbe. And he says as follows, that when the Torah tells us about what happened at Mount Sinai in our Parsha, let's just read the verse and how the Torah describes it. Torah describes the reception that it got amongst the Jewish people. What does it say? All the people saw the voices and the torches and the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain. And the people saw and they trembled. Vayanu vayamdu merachok, and they stood back. They stood from afar. The verse continues. Again, we're still in the Parsha. If you want to follow along, chapter 20, verse 16. Vayomra Moshe. the people said to Moshe, Daber ata imanu v'nishma. Please, you speak, you tell us the instructions and we'll listen. We can't handle the great revelation of God. It's just too much for us. Moshe says to the people, do not fear. Because God has come in order to exalt you. And in order that his awe should be upon your faces, so that you should not sin. So the people remained distant, far off. Moshe nigash el harafel. Moshe is the one who drew closer to the arafel, the opaque darkness. Asher shama alekim, where God's revelation, or the divine revelation was. This is the verse in the Parsha, and it seems here that if you read this, it looks like the Jews couldn't handle the voice of God directly speaking to them. So they asked Moshe to, so to say, be that intermediary. And what's interesting is, there's a medrash that analyzes this and says that the first commandment, the heavens and earth quaked when God spoke. The waters and the rivers fled. The mountains and hills were moved. All the trees were shaken. And the people just fainted. They couldn't handle such a great divine revelation as was going on Mount Sinai, as the Medrash puts it. And that's why the people came to Moshe. They just couldn't handle this. So the first two commandments they heard from God, and the rest they asked Moshe to convey to them. So the Gemara has a question. Darash Rav Simloi, one of the great sages, Rav Simloi, taught. 613 mitzvahs God conveyed to Moshe in the Torah. And we know of those, 365 are prohibitions corresponding to the numbers of the days in the solar year. And there's 248 positive mitzvahs corresponding to Ramah Chevarav, the 248 limbs that we have. Says Rav Hamnuna, this is in the Gemara, what's this? Where do we know this from? And he quotes a verse in our Parsha that says Moshe commanded us the Torah. Torah tziva lanu Moshe marasha kilas Yaakov. That this Torah that Moshe gave us is the inheritance of the congregation of Yaakov, meaning us, the Jewish people, the descendants. If you look at the gematria, the word Torah is, anyone know? Anyone want us to do the calculation quickly? The gematria, the numerical value of the word Torah is 611. 611 is the number of mitzvahs that we received from Moshe Rabbeinu. Two more mitzvahs. The first two commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. And the second commandment, La Yilach Alekim Rachem, you should have no other gods before me, that we heard directly from God. So while the Jews were there and they were just so overpowered by that divine energy, and they asked Moshe to articulate the rest of the commandments. They just couldn't hear it conveyed directly by God. So the Jews actually were supposed to hear everything from God according to what the Talmud is saying here. But our failure, our ancestors, but in essence, us, why do I say us? It says in the Medrash that every single soul that was destined to live was present at Mount Sinai. So in that sense, every one of us was present there. So it was our failure that led to, sorry guys, I'm just trying to fix up my computer screen, something funny here. It was our failure that led us to this situation where we couldn't handle the divine energy. All right. So this is one instance of our failure to live up to the plan. And it was actually a disappointment, so to say, the Talmud is saying here. And Moshe, in fact, admonished us for this when we came to the Holy Land. Look in the book of Devarim, chapter 5, verse 24. And there, Moshe says to the people that I was distressed about this situation. You weakened me because I saw that you couldn't handle this divinity, the divine revelation. Would have been better for you to hear the commandments directly from God, Moshe says to the people. So Moshe, in a sense, he's saying that you guys, I don't know why, where the shortcoming was. Now the question is it Moshe's shortcoming or is it the people's shortcoming? According to the Talmud, Moshe miscalculated how ready the people were for divine revelation. Moshe, the great leader that he was fully ready for it. But what about the people? He thought the people were ready to hear directly from God. And obviously they vetoed that plan by telling him, no, enough. We need to hear you tell it to us, not God. So what's going on here? Okay. Says the Medrash, it's not the first time. Why does Moshe miscalculate the capabilities of his people? So where does this come from? Let's get a little bit of a deeper understanding of what's going on here. So that was the narrative in the Torah, the way the Talmud illustrates and elaborates on this. But I want to try to get a little bit of a better understanding of Moshe's insistence, why he prefers that we should hear the Torah directly from God. And why in our Parsha, again, twice we have this, where Moshe insists on judging the people himself rather than implementing the system, which he eventually did, as Yisro suggested. But why, to begin with, does he feel like doing it by himself? Why did his father-in-law need to advise him to set up this system of hierarchy? Now we think about it. Moshe is an incredible person, a man of God. He literally saw God like we see each other right now. He saw God. He saw and he understood God. He got it. And when he received the Torah, the divine will and wisdom, he received it directly from Hashem. It was on the loftiest level. It was pure, pristine. It was completely divinity. And Moshe wanted the Jewish people to experience Torah and godliness the same way as he did. He wanted to lend them a window into that sublime reality of seeing God. So he figured they should experience the visual God for themselves. They should be able to hear the Ten Commandments directly from Hashem, without his interference, without an intermediary. Why get the second-hand version when you can get the real deal? Now you may ask, can the average person really get the real deal? The reality, as many of us could attest to, is that not all of us are there. Maybe you are. I'm thinking about myself. I'm not at that level, per se, okay? Well, not all of us are on Moshe Rabbeinu's level. So, what was Moshe thinking? Here comes a beautiful insight that I read from the Rebbe's teachings. The Rebbe explains that Moshe knew good and well that we weren't cut out. We weren't on his same level for this divine cognizance. Naturally, we stood at Mount Sinai. We couldn't see what Moshe saw. We couldn't survive that experience. It was just too much for us to handle. But Moshe also knew that he had the ability to bring them to that place. And by being in the presence, by being a true qualified leader, Moshe could take the people to levels of divine recognition that was far beyond the capability of reaching on their own. Moshe felt that he could uplift the people. He could bring them to that better place. That's the quality of leadership. Moshe wasn't ignoring the reality. He wasn't oblivious to it. He was looking toward a much greater goal that hopefully with his qualities of greatness and of his leadership, he knew that could become a reality for the people. He wanted to lift them up. And so that was Moshe, as the Rebbe put it, that was Moshe's person. And the Rebbe lived that way. Let me share with you a story. You know Rabbi Weinberg here in Johannesburg? You might know the younger Rabbi Weinberg's the grandfather, Rabbi Levi Weinberg, who was my Rosh Yeshiva when I was in Pretoria studying to become a rabbi 18 years ago. Rabbi Weinberg shared with us a story that happened to his father. And I remember his father, blessed memory, he passed away a few years ago, close to 100 years old. He was here in Johannesburg very many times. And he relates a story that once he had a letter, an envelope he wanted to give the Rebbe. So he took the envelope. He didn't want to bother the Rebbe. So he stuck it under the door to the Rebbe's office. He worked for Lubavitch World Headquarters. He was one of the fundraising staff. He was a mashbak. He traveled the world. He came in many times to South Africa already from the early 1940s. He was traveling here. I think he passed away around 2015. Anyways, Rabbi Weinberg relates that he realized afterwards, goodness, the Rebbe was an elderly person. This is a story that happened in the 70s or 80s. You know, the Rebbe was if it's the 70s, the Rebbe was in the 70s. Or the 80s, the Rebbe was born in 1901. So he felt bad what he did. So later, the next day, he apologized to the Rebbe. He said, I'm so sorry for making you bend down to pick up my envelope. I wasn't thinking. You know, he thought he was. And the Rebbe turned to him with a broad smile and said, isn't that my responsibility? To uplift? That's the way the Rebbe saw Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe uplifts the people. That's what Moshe wanted to do. He wanted to bring the people up. He felt that was his mission. He felt responsible to make it happen so that they shouldn't lose out. And that's why he wanted God should speak directly to them. Why only I should experience that? You should experience it. But the people obviously didn't feel like they could handle that. So then the question is, why did they reject it? Who wouldn't want such an amazing free ride? Moshe is willing to uplift you, to bring you to this great place. And here's the answer again, as the Rebbe saw it, where we're putting on the Rebbe's glasses. And his perspective was, because the Jews wanted to understand the Torah on their own merits, using their own capabilities. You know, if everything is spoon-fed to you, if everything is just taken care of, all for free, sometimes we lose out of that. So, in other words, the experience of seeing things as Moshe did was no doubt amazing. Certainly valuable, but how could it affect a Jew as a real person with real challenges, with real struggles and limitations that us corporeal Homo sapien human beings have? So yes, after being taken by Moshe to the highest spiritual heights, experiencing the divine revelation, which Moshe wanted them to experience, but an experience without a process is going to die and fizzle out. So if you really want to grow, we need a bottom-up approach. Moshe had good intentions. He wanted us to experience what he experienced, and we got that experience for the first 2 commandments. And no doubt we appreciated the value of that experience, the divine revelation at Mount Sinai. But there's more than that. We need that understanding to become our own. We want to use our own brains. We want it to penetrate, to permeate every fiber of our being. So it might not be as romantic as soaring to those spiritual heights. But this is the point, though. The idea is that we should experience it. And this was the Rebbe's perspective, and it's so rich reading it in his work. Let me read it to you from the Yiddish
in Likutei Sichos, the way the Rebbe says it, Yidden haben aber geteinet. As much as this is a great experience, they weren't satisfied with the spiritual heights, with attaining the greatest heights. They knew that would be a wonderful, outstanding experience, but they wanted to make it their own. And this is the point of what happened with the revelation of Mount Sinai. And this is the point of what happened with judging the people. Why Moshe tried to give them the great experience, the way he experienced it, in the most spiritual way as he did. And Moshe knew that would be outstanding. Maybe he knew the people would complain otherwise. He wanted to give them a taste of it. And that's why it says that Shechina medaberes mitoch grona. The people wanted it a little bit. It should become a personal experience. And Moshe himself experienced it. So let's hear it from you directly. So that's a very fascinating and different way of seeing this. And it's a question that you can apply to life. Which way is it better to do things? Top down or bottom up? And this was Moshe's dilemma at that stage. Moshe felt it's important that he forge a personal relationship directly with the Jewish people. He could bring God's greatness to each person as he experienced it. And if that's the case, only he experienced it. No one else did. Not the elders, not the leaders, no one else, not even his brother Aaron. Many great leaders are very busy. There's no time for them to interact with the common people. I have secretaries and this, that, you can't do it directly with them. Some people are just too busy to meet with anyone who comes their way. Some prefer that exclusiveness. I got my nice leather chair, I got my office, and I could even be playing golf and pretend that I'm very, very busy. And that's very common amongst leaders. They prefer that you call their PA, their secretary. They'll schedule a meeting with one department or the other department and check the calendar and see if there's anything more important happening. You know how it goes. And eventually maybe you'll get the meeting. But Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want that hierarchy at all. He didn't want a system where you have to go through loops and hoops. He didn't want a system where you're going to have to go through all that red tape. He experienced divinity directly. He wanted to give it directly to the people. He wanted without any filters. And that's why he wanted to take up each and every case. Every single petition that he wanted to deal with it himself. He wanted in that process to bring the people closer to God. And that was the basis of Moshe's perspective, why he was judging the people and why no one else had their recommendation. But it was Yisro, father-in-law, who said, why should you, the great leader, have to judge every little case? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, it's my responsibility to be there for them. It's my responsibility to uplift the people like no one else can. I'm the one who experienced it. So if Yisro said, there isn't enough time in the day for you to do that. Moshe says, when you operate on this level, things go very quickly. As we know, the other famous story when someone asked the Rebbe, the Moshe of our time, how does he have the time to meet so many people? When I was a kid, you could watch countless videos because the Rebbe was a visionary and everything was on video. He spent 8 hours or more on a Sunday giving $1 and a blessing to every person that came by. And someone who was, the Rebbe was around 90 when the story happened, and this 70-year-old came by and said, how do you stand for so many hours? And his response was, when you're counting diamonds, you don't get tired. Every person is a precious diamond. Everyone's indispensable in God's eyes, and the Rebbe saw it from that perspective. Moshe Rabbeinu saw God. He saw the Torah. He saw the law. He didn't have to spend hours breaking his head to get it. So he thought that by interacting with the people, he could transmit it directly as he experienced it. When everyone sees the godly reality and truth, then he thinks all issues will be sorted out quickly. You don't need magistrates. You don't need a hierarchy system. You don't need this whole, and imagine the budgets that would be involved with it, right? So Moshe, it's a whole different way of seeing it. It's not that he missed the point, so simple, and he could have just delegated. Moshe didn't want to delegate something that he could deal with himself, that he wanted the people to experience. It's not about delegation. He had real, grounded and practical reasons why only he himself could judge the people. It was all for the sake of elevating, of uplifting the people to a place that they couldn't reach otherwise, because no one else had that experience except for him. So now the obvious question then is, so why did he listen to his father-in-law? And of course, it was with God's consent. He wouldn't have done it otherwise. And obviously, it's a good point. But the Rebbe addresses that point too. He says, that's what was sustainable in long terms. Of course, Moshe could uplift the people like nobody else could. But the day would come and Moshe no longer would be there to nurture them. And what would be then? So that's why Yisro was the one who cautioned him that without that infrastructure, without training a hierarchy of judges under him, the whole system could collapse. And what's going to be then? And in that sense, I just think about this. How in the years, like I said, today's the yahrzeit of the Rebbetzin who passed away in 1988. And after she passed away, the Rebbe went on this major campaign of encouraging people to heed the Mishnah that we read yesterday, Aseh L'Charab, that people should have mentors. I think he saw very clearly what's going to be. There was going to be a gap. There was going to be a time when he's no longer going to be with us in the physical sense. And he knew that people are going to need that leadership. And if without him, he said, everyone should have mentors. As is very clearly stated in Jewish law, Aseh L'Charav, people should have a mentor, people should have a teacher. So Moshe's idea was to uplift the people, yet still there was a necessity for the delegation. And that's why at first he did it his way. And then he accepted for long-term sustainability, the long-term plan. And obviously when it came to these issues, and obviously there's always issues that people have, it became necessary to have a hierarchy system. There had to be a process which the later leaders would gain experience, Moshe's experience, so to say, so that the tradition could be passed on. When Moshe would no longer be there, and the people's issues and all their legal disputes and all the problems, they're not going to magically melt away. There had to be somebody to answer the phone. So that's exactly the point of why ultimately he did go with the plan. So Moshe's method was to uplift, to educate the people. I mean, by him, he thought that they're going to get that revelation by osmosis, so to say. That wasn't a pun, osmosis. But the other way to uplift a person is to let the person be themselves. That each person sees their own shortcomings, their own ego, and after an honest reckoning and realizing our own problems, then hopefully we get the chance, if we take a good, sincere, honest look at ourselves in the mirror, we could lift ourselves up and step by step improve our ways. And that's where the hierarchy system comes into the picture in our parsha as well. The job of the various judges was to address the day-to-day challenges without magic. This wasn't osmosis. This was by grit, working together with each and every single issue. And that's when you could help them with hard work to overcome one's challenges. So of course, compared to Moshe's dramatic effect on a person, the effect of the lower judges, you could say, is laughable. How does that compare to Moshe, who experienced divine revelation? And that's why it wasn't his first option. But Yisro showed Moshe that when the people could be themselves with guidance, then they could work on themselves from the bottom up. And ultimately, they could take ownership for their own growth, that it's not just Moshe does everything, Moshe inspires us, but rather, you work on yourself, you could actually attain and reach the highest levels as well. So let's conclude. This idea, like Moshe, and I feel so appropriate, especially today, on this yahrzeit of the Rebbetzin, that the Rebbe, as a modern day Jewish leader, is showing us the importance of why this advice is important. And the Rebbe wanted to be as accessible to the people as possible, as we saw, as you could see, the way he interacted, even with a little kid, with anyone. Thousands and thousands of letters came pouring into his office, and he replied himself. When they brought him a machine to open the envelopes to make it easier, he refused to accept it. He says envelopes that were sealed with the tears of people who've written these letters, I have to open it in person. And so he felt, yes, on the one hand, he dealt with so many things, but at the same time, the Rebbe also instituted the system of delegating and having shluchim, emissaries of rabbis and rebbitzins around the world. And to him, it didn't make a difference if you were a big rabbi or anyone. Every person was important. Every single individual, Jew or Gentile, child or adult or senior, whatever it was, every person got that moment with him that was, that one moment could last an eternity. And obviously, in his earlier years, he had more time to give people, but as the community grew, and I just think we experienced that sense in our lifetime of having a person like the Rebbe who could inspire and lift a person above their own challenges, but oftentimes he would do it. And remind me to show you the video next week, the story of Rabbi Weinreb. He told the story here at the Sinai Daba a couple of years ago. I love that story. It's probably best for you to hear from him himself, but let me conclude by sharing that story with you. The story was that he should be healthy and well. He's a man in his 80s today, living in Israel, the head of the Orthodox Union, that in his younger years, he describes he was a fresh, new, I think this is in the 1970s or so. He was a fresh, new, is he a psychologist maybe? I don't remember his position, something like that. And he needed advice. He was having a midlife crisis, as he put it. And he called the Rebbe's office anonymously, asking for an appointment to talk to the Rebbe about his midlife crisis issues. And the Rebbe said to him, if you're from, not the Rebbe, the secretary was conveying the Rebbe's message. If you live in Maryland, you know there's a great doctor there who's also a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Dr. Weinreb. And he said, hold on, I am Rabbi Dr. Weinreb. And without missing a beat, the Rebbe's response was, well, sometimes you have to speak to yourself. And I think that's the point, is that sometimes, where do we start? When we look at ourselves, right, we don't necessarily see who we really are. And if, we have an excuse, we have an explanation. We discussed this yesterday. We have our self-love and, and the cozy cushion of our own self-protection. We're subjective to our own situations. And, our love blinds us, right? So we have to know then when to turn to others, when to look up to a mentor. Asay lecha rav. It was such an important message that Yisro teaches us in our Parsha. Every one of us has to have a mentor, a human being, in someone in whom we could confide and we could discuss these important matters of our life. And the value of having such a confidant, of somebody we could speak to, someone we know who we look up to, someone who's smarter than us. As we said earlier, this applies to every aspect, whether it's business, whether it's exercise. That's why you go to a coach. And certainly when it comes to spirituality as well, we want someone who can give us feedback. It can help us grow in every way that we can. And I think that's very important, as the Mishnah teaches us, as Yisro and our Parsha teaches us, and as life teaches us, the value of having mentorship, of having somebody, a relatable person to talk to, someone who appreciates us, someone perhaps has gone through maybe similar struggles. And the point is, we have to work on ourselves in whatever way possible. We need a long-term solution. And of course, we have to know that it's the long-term work that's going to yield the greatest effect and the greatest success. So learn from the Parsha this week. Take that message. Please God, we could all find in our own lives as well the benefit of having personal growth and success, as we could see in the Parsha, in the very week where we learn about God giving us the Torah. And perhaps just a final thought that comes from my mind, my own boich svara, as it's called. Why is this week's Parsha, which is the most monumental event in all of history, God giving us the Torah, not called Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments? Why is it not called by some other name that would perhaps imply how, this great event? It's called Yisro. And maybe because the advice that Yisro gave is the tool for advice on how to make Torah our own. The only way we could truly make the Torah our own is if we take that advice that Yisro gave. It can't just be osmosis. It can't just be spoon-fed. It's something we have to work on ourselves, each one of us. You want to make the Torah your own? Work on it. That was Yisro's advice. It can't just come from Moshe. Each one of us has to make it our own. The rabbi could preach and speak, but each one of us has to work on ourselves. The rabbi is a mentor. The rabbi is meant to guide us, to advise us, but it's up to each of us on our own to make it happen. With that in mind, ladies and gents, time to end, but I wish you the tremendous success in all your endeavors, and may we take the lessons and messages of the Parsha and apply them in our lives, and look forward to continue our studies together. So this week, make sure to see the Big Ten. Zakazant, everyone. See you, please, God, next week.